story
greater detail.
How do we just do it? You just ask me questions and
Yeah,
I just
I'll
talk
ask questions, and if you want to stop and say something else, and you just say something else.
Okay.
All right. Good
Can we
afternoon.
look at the camera rather than you? Is that
Look at yeah.
No, look at Paul.
Oh, I'm
look at
sorry.
Paul.
You're right. Yeah, as I said, I've done 98 of these. And good afternoon.
Afternoon.
I'm Paul Musgrave. It's March 26, 2009. We're interviewing Red Cavaney for the Richard Nixon Oral History Project, and we're here in his offices in Washington, D.C. Mr. Cavaney, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, we were talking off camera just a second ago about your time at USC, and I want to talk about that because the USC, I don't want to call it a mafia like the Kennedy-Boston Mafia, but there's certainly a group of you. But tell us a little bit about how you got to USC. Where are you from? Where'd you grow up?
I'm originally from Southern California. Grew up all in that area. My parents and my parents' parents and my uncles and aunts and everything, they all went to USC. So I was sort of destined to go there. But at the time I had to figure out a way how to finance my education since it was a private school. So I tried out for and eventually got an NROTC scholarship, and so that's how I worked my way through school. It had a price to it, and that was that you went into service after you graduated, and I didn't, at the time when I signed up, realize that we would be in the Vietnam conflict, and then I would end up serving 3 tours of combat duty over there afterwards before I was finally released in June of 1969.
Now you would have entered, I guess, fall of 1960? At USC?
That's right.
So
from Alhambra High School, which Alhambra is one of the adjacent cities to Los Angeles. It wasn't too far a drive.
What did you think about, you obviously didn't know Vice President Nixon at that point, but what were your feelings about the presidential campaign?
Well, at the time, I'd always had a great love for the politics of how you make public policy, how our nation develops and goes in one direction or another, and how it's led and so forth. And that fascination, I practiced a bit when I was in high school, and then when I got to college, I had an opportunity through some relationships to begin to become active in various political entities that they had on campus. And many of the people that became very good and dear friends, even to this day, actively worked together on the campus, got to know this and that and everything. And then, of course, as I said, when I got graduated, I went into the military, and so I was sort of gone. And they all continued, ended up in various parts of the Nixon campaign. First of all, the one in '66 in California, and then the '68 campaign, which proved successful. So I missed a big gap with all of my buddies, and I was sorry to do that. But we became, while we were in many different fraternities, we became a fraternity of people who had the same love for politics and the politics of governing and the like.
Now, I think, were Dwight and Ron and Sandy, were they all Deeks? What were they?
No, they were different. Dwight was a Sigma Chi. I was a KA. We always used to trade swaps about, Dwight said, geez, I wish I'd have been a KA, but he was a year ahead of me, so that was already decided. There was other folks like Mike Guin, Gordon Strawn was around, John Schlaze was around, so they were in many different houses, but we had this sort of, as I said, common interest, and as you tend to buddy up with folks who are going to do something a little unusual, and that's how we all got together and formed the beginning of what became lifelong friendships.
I know that Dwight and Sandy actually were both working with the '62 campaign, the campaign for governor. Mm-hmm. Did you get involved in that?
I didn't. During that, I mean, I did a little bit of volunteer work, right. but basically I was in school trying to make sure I got my grades and did what I did and had plenty of time to play. And I did, because I figured I knew I had this commitment ahead of me, so I enjoyed thoroughly my whole college experience, and a lot of the things I learned there were lessons that were outside the textbook, so it was a good growing experience for me too.
Well, one thing that Steve Bull mentioned, and it's kind of stuck with me, and is that he mentioned that there was a real difference between people who started their college careers 60, 61, 62, and people who started their college careers 64, 65. Did you feel that at the time?
Markedly so. Markedly so. I think if somebody looked at it, at least from my perspective, and put a really good microscope down and looked and said, where did things start to change? I think if you went into school in 60, 61, somewhere in that age, you probably still were more a part of the generation of the 50s, the silent generation as it's often referred to. And then because I had sisters and cousins and others who were in that class as 64, 65, 66, 67 and all that, that was the very beginning of the sort of new awareness, or what became the sort of the next generation. And they just looked at life very, very differently. And but in my period of time, only in my last year at 64, could I start to see some of that change. And it wasn't until after being gone for 5 years during the military service and coming back was it so dramatic, where I could really see the difference between how people lived their life, what their aspirations were, how they set their priorities, and what they set about doing.
In some ways, it must have been like coming back to a different country.
It was. We get, as I said, when in the military, you get things like their publications, their newspapers, and you see things, and then of course you get home leave every now and then, and you get little snippets of it, but you don't really fully understand it until you got back. And I think the big disappointment for me was during the period that I was in school and preceding that when I was in high school and all, there was this unbelievable shot of patriotism that was held by everyone, man, woman, and child, whether they served during World War II or not. And then when I returned, one of the things that was really disappointing was anytime you were seen wearing your uniform or somebody knew that you served in Vietnam, you became a subject of ridicule. People would spit on you. They'd end up, shoving you and using curse words. And it was really sort of a very huge change in what I would say is less than 10 years. Less than 10 years. Now, we've worked our way through and past all that kind of thing, and I think that's for the good of the country.
Well, I want to get back to 69 when you come back, but I just wanted to ask you a little bit. You did 3 combat tours in the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
Where were you? Just a second. We're trying to figure out what that noise is, but...
Basically, I served 2 of those tours on minesweepers and inshore boats. If you looked at Vietnam from sort of the Saigon River, everything to the south of that was principally water, mangrove swamps and things of that nature. And so 2 of those assignments I had were actually along the shore and going inshore, and that whole area down there with small boat craft.
So brown water Navy.
Brown water Navy, as you'd call it, yeah. And then one of my tours was in a ship called the Berkeley, and their duty, they were one of the early generation search and rescue and missile-equipped ships, and we used to camp outside of Haiphong Harbor during what was called Rolling Thunder operations, and that's when the aircraft carriers would launch the flights. They'd come in and check out over us, and the other ships go in and then come out, and our job was to ensure that any chase planes that were coming after them, we would filter them and take care of them and, rescue down pilots and go in and do various things like that. So we operated in that area up there.
And then were you rotating in and out of Vietnam?
I did, yeah. Each of those was a tour. One of them, I was on my way back, and I never even made it to the mainland. I got as far as Honolulu after one tour, and Vice President Johnson had then involuntarily extended us, because I was supposed to get out after 4 years. My deal was 4 years of service in return for 4 years of college. But they were short of, they were trying to turn the war effort over to the Vietnamese at that time, and they were letting the U.S. sort of, how shall we say, reduce the number of troop commitments, but they got caught a bit short, and so what they had to do was extend some classes. Mine happened to be one, so I did a 5th year, and that's how I got, which was very unusual for somebody to do three combat tours, because usually the rule of thumb, if you did one, then you got a nice shore duty assignment. That didn't quite work out that way.
And you were an officer?
An officer, yeah. I got out as a Navy lieutenant.
Did you think at all about the implications of the war? Because being a part of the effort must have been very different from what people at home. They called it the television war, but obviously for you it wasn't television.
It wasn't. I have people who served with me, and all their names are on the wall just a few blocks from here. And it was very, you grew up awful fast, and I learned a lot of lessons, principally from a lot of the enlisted people who, I won't say they were a surrogate father, but at least people around there that would help you understand, a lot about the military coming in, because you were expected to perform right away, never really having been exposed to something like what we had there. But on the other hand, looking back on it, when I came out, I felt my capabilities in terms of management, in terms of motivating folks, in terms of leadership potential and things like that, were I must have got 20 years worth of experience during that period of time. And so while I didn't get the graduate degree that I had always hoped and planned to have, when I came out, I didn't feel inferior in terms of skill sets and competitive capability towards some of those folks that had done that because of things I learned there. So on balance, it was tough on my marriage. I had 2 young kids during that period of time who wasn't anywhere near when they were born. But we worked through that. My wife was tremendous at the time. She subsequently passed away. But it was big learning experience. Made you grow up fast.
It must have been a little bit of a transition to come back in '69, and I'm interested in how did you end up working at the White House?
This goes back to the friendships. I came back and I had to sort of figure out, well, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And having missed the opportunity to go to graduate school, which I wanted to do to get the MBA, I kind of figured out in my mind's eye, well, how am I going to make up for that lost time and also get a paycheck during the same period? And so I figured out, after a whole series of generous offers and all, that I wanted to go to work for a commercial bank. And well, because bank is at the core of all finance. Things don't move without finance. We know that now today, maybe better than we knew it back then. Nobody ever says no to a banker. So when you go to call on a commercial account to ask if you can put together a loan package, handle their receivables financing or whatever. So I thought that by doing that, I would be able to get a first-hand, hands-on knowledge about all the things that I would have got out of a book, shall we say, in discussions with others. So I took a job in Orange County, which is where at the time I lived, and was at work there. And
you were down in Irvine?
Irvine, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I worked for Security Pacific Bank, which was eventually acquired by Bank of America, which was acquired by another bank, but kept the name Bank of America. And one day I'm sitting there sort of minding my business, and I get this call from a guy named Dewey Clower. And Dewey Clower had been told by Ron Walker to give this guy Red Cavaney next time we come out west to the White House, Western White House, see if he'll come down and meet with us, and let's see. And Dwight Chapin had told Ron Walker about me and see him whenever you're out there again. And I didn't know it exactly at the time, but this was a coordinated effort where they had decided that within the White House they were going to go around and try and identify as volunteer advancemen approximately 50 or so of the young people who had the fire in the belly or the aptitude or the potential aptitude to be good advancemen. And so they tried during this period of time to identify them and then give them volunteer training and have them help out when the campaign came to pass. So I got this call from Dewey and said, we'd like to have you come down and have a beer or two with us and let us get to know you and tell us about what's going on in your life. So I took up that opportunity and did so, and went down. San Clemente is probably a 35-minute drive from Irvine, so it wasn't too far. And saw these folks, got a chance to talk with Ron and some of these. I saw Dwight for a very brief period of time, but spent most of my time getting familiar with these other folks who were full-time advanced people. And it's sort of wetted the whistle that I had from my college days about the interest in politics. So I was very interested. They asked me if I wanted to be a volunteer and explained how that would work. And so when I got back, I went and talked to my employer, said I had this opportunity to do this? And they said, oh, by all means, yes, as long as you do your job and get everything done you need to do, we'll be glad to support you. So that's how it all got started.
And this is 69 or 70?
Late 69, early 70.
Late 69, okay. Had you known Bob Haldeman?
I had not, no. No, as I say, I missed that period of time when a lot of those folks worked very directly with him when they did the campaigns in 66 and 68, but
Right.
I didn't.
So what's your first assignment as a volunteer advanceman?
We went up, the president was going to the Bohemian Grove up north of San Francisco, and there was a military base at the time that was being tuned down where they would fly into and all, and so my job was, Dewey Clower was going to be the lead on that, and so my responsibility was to sort of learn and do all the things that you do, drawing out diagrams. They didn't have computers in those days, or hardly fax machines or anything, so you plotted everything and you coordinated the security with who needed to be there for greetings and all those things. So it was a fairly simple first advance trip, so it was really kind of hard to screw it up, I guess I would say. And from my standpoint, I guess I didn't screw it up because I got invited back, and then each subsequent event that I was asked to do, they'd give you a different part of a larger task, and it was really it was training grounds for for bigger and better things. And each one that I did, I got that much more excited about the creativity that you can use, the leadership you can exhibit, and trying to top the other guy, if you will, and doing that event with more timeliness, larger crowds, more color, all the kind of things that you do there.
Well, in talking to some of the people who were advancemen, and I read Charles Stewart's books, I mean, it seems like there is a real sense that this is a production. It's almost like a Broadway musical coming to town.
No question.
What's it like? How do you start with a blank sheet of paper?
Well, that's actually the best part. Sometimes you're delivered something. The president's going to be here. He's got to deliver the speech. He's going to do these 4 or 5 things, and we need to have you figure out how to work them all out. Other times the president had this opportunity to come down and do something at a university or at a hospital or someplace, and we don't really know what to do. We didn't have a time to do a pre-advance to go down and work out in much detail. Would you, we're going to put you in there a day or 2 early, and you figure it all out, and we'll do something like that. So you really did start with like a blank stage, and that was the fun part, because that's where you really could be creative. You could think up some unusual settings. One that comes to mind was at Florida Atlantic University, which was a fairly new university. President had an invitation to go down and give the commencement address, and they had typically had a big front lawn out, and the buildings were modern and squat, and so it didn't really look like a university when you shot the picture. So I got a chance to roam around, and I go around to the back of this same building where the land had fallen off a little bit. Doesn't fall off too much in Florida, but enough. And they had this huge, massive, big pool with a fountain in the middle of it, and they'd actually dug down sides like a little amphitheater and all. So I'm looking there, and they had a big, sort of like a patio, if you will, from the back of the building that jutted out and sort of looked over all of this stuff. So, I'm sitting there saying, wow, now this is really something. You could put the president up there, you could have all these people, so it'd be tiered like an arena thing. The crowd would be low, so it would look very good, and you could step back. And because the land fell off, the buildings would look all that much bigger and more dramatic and all. So then I figured out, okay, now I've got to go in and sell the president of the university on draining his pond, going and renting all these chairs and doing all this, as opposed to what they normally did out in front. And the guy was really good. He wanted this to be a success, so we went and walked around there, and he had trouble envisioning it the first day, and he said, well, let me sleep on this. And the next morning he came back and he says, brilliant idea, we're going to do that. And so we did. So I just use that as an example of the kinds of things that we enjoyed as a challenge, and you always wanted to push the envelope so that what you did was unique, that you could just look at a picture, say 20 years later, and say, oh, that was in such and such, or that was in that town, or this was so and so. And that's sort of how it was a competition, if you will, friendly competition. We never competed against one another to get a better assignment necessarily or this, but what we tried to do was to try and create memorable events that people would say, that was a great shot. The message we wanted to convey got across, or the photos we wanted were perfect. We captured above the fold on the newspapers and all that.
Well, what I've heard is that there was a saying, I think it was headline photo, quote caption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you actually think in these terms?
Oh yeah. What you wanted, that's why I say getting a picture that really said it all without the caption. Sometimes you got lucky and you could say this caption, this photo were made and go there. But like in the case I just described about the university commencement, we had another message we wanted to convey, and they were the backdrop. So you wanted it to look like a commencement and look like it was big, and to the rest of the world they don't know, that university, but it did. And then the line that he was trying to make at that time did come across. So it was always, what's our objective? What are we trying to get out of there? And how can we most effectively communicate that to the nation?
Now, presidential advance work has got to be different from campaign advance work.
Yes.
It's a different atmosphere. I know that on campaign advance, sometimes the RNC would pick this up, or the campaign would pick something up, or the local Republican Party or local donors would pick something up. How did you work that angle, the logistical details? Well, with Florida Atlantic, I mean, you have the host institution providing a lot of the...
They did what they did, and then of course the White House provided things, that communication. They always wanted the system because it was recorded for posterity, so that was their system. But the host always picked up the event. Now, more often than not, you didn't just go to an area necessarily and always do just one event. You may also be doing a political event or an event with another institution. So you had to keep books, if you will, separate, so that the costs were always allocable. Those that were allocable to a political context got charged to the Republican National Committee. Those to the university got charged to the university. Those that maybe you went to a senior citizens home or something like that, maybe, they got allocated to there and then were paid out of whatever account. So our job was to make sure we collected all the receipts, we knew what the bills were, we tried to stay within a budget, and then we just had to send them on. Now, what happened to them after that was somebody else's deal. But yeah, if you couldn't, they didn't want to get them all in the shoebox, mixed together and all that. So that was part of it.
How many events would public events would you typically be planning for each day? 1, 2 on a presidential trip?
Typically, what you would like to do back in those days, I think with the 24/7 media that we have today and all the multiple means of distribution that are available, you do it a different way. But back then, what you wanted was one feature event during the day that would, in essence, be the photo, have the tagline, and be the substance of what you wanted to convey. What was the president doing? What was the messages he was trying to do? And then oftentimes you would then have ancillary events that would allow you to identify more closely and personally, in many cases, with the community, with the town, with the county, whatever the case may be, or do something of a political nature, help a candidate who is running for office, or be a speaker at a fundraiser. They're trying to build up the coffers. So there were these, what I would call satellite or ancillary events, oftentimes that were there, but you really never wanted to be in the same ground and do two events that would compete with each other and sort of fuzz up, if you will, the clarity of the message you wanted to convey. Now, you can do 2 events or 3 events on the same day in different cities. So, and that's not unusual that you fly down, let's say, and hit one state in the morning, fly and hit another one in the late afternoon, and things of that nature.
How much latitude did you have? Did you have to check back? First of all, who did you report to when you started doing these things? Dewey at first?
At the time, Ron Walker ran the advance operation, and this was when I was a volunteer leading up to the 72 campaign. And who I generally reported to was one of the full-time advancemen that were there, and I was one of these, I think, 4 or 5 dozen trainees, if you will, who were learning. And then eventually, as we went along, we got an opportunity to be our own lead, and one of the permanent advance folks might drop by for half a day or something and just check on you and see how things were going. But generally, we were our own boss with pretty good guidance. Dave Parker, who ran the scheduling office, and Ron Walker, who ran the advance. Usually they had an opportunity for some advance person to go down and look at the event and size up what they wanted to get out of it, and then they would come back and put together a little package which sort of had, here's kind of what we notionally want to do, and we're going to focus on a message like this and all that. And so you stayed within those parameters, but again, your creativity and how you did it and all was really left up to the advanced team that was on the site.
I'm thinking here of some of the ways in which the advance work was used. There's the trip to Guam, which is a little bit before your time, the '69 trip to Guam, the Nixon doctrine trip. But then there's also, and I can't remember, I think it's San Jose State, where President Nixon, the media bus is attacked. But rocks being thrown at the press bus.
Wasn't one of my trips.
Wasn't one of your
trips.
trips.
I missed that one. Yeah.
Were demonstrators were obviously a part of life at that point.
They were,
and especially for someone who elicited such strong feelings as President Nixon did. How did you account for that? How did you
Well, what you have to operate within the rights of the law, and you couldn't be in a position to stand at the door and say you can come in and you can't come in. So what you tried to do was to create environments around which the president would be seen that would capture the picture of the moment that you were trying to present. And the things that didn't fall in that venue, that they took place or occurred, if they were going to occur, outside that immediate environment. And so what typically you would do would be dress the stage, whether it was in various kinds of props, palm trees and this and that, or whether it was a crowd of dignitaries, or whether it was a group that was being honored from a hospital or some special people. So you put that up there, and then you would typically have a VIP seated area where a lot of the local dignitaries and people that worked that you would ticket it, and you'd provide the tickets, and then the rest would be, as we would say, general public or something of that nature. And so they were allowed in, but typically a good distance, away from the area that was where the prime event and the president's most direct exposure was going to take place.
When do you turn pro as an advance man?
I think you earn your medal, if you will, when you do your first lead on a trip where nobody else is checking on you. You're the person that is at the bottom of the ramp when the president lands. Ron Walker comes off the plane. You give him the thumbs up. You feel really good about what you've got ahead. President comes down and it flows just like it was. I don't know what that is. I'm sorry. Okay. And you give the thumbs up to Ron Walker that everything's going to be okay. President, maybe the First Lady come down the plane, and they end up going through the whole thing, and then you're driving back in the motorcade, and everything has gone even better than you'd hoped. You get this big lump in your throat because you say, oh my gosh, don't let anything happen on the way back to ruin, my big moment in the sun. And so it's when literally the president gets on the plane, walks up those steps, they close up, plane goes off, and it's called wheels up. It was literally when that set of wheels lifted off the tarmac, then you felt, wow, okay, I did it. And there's a custom that it developed, I think, by Ron. And the idea was that you've had to do a lot of things in here, and the moment was the president. The moment wasn't you and your team and everything. So you typically had a little get-together for a wheels-up party, thank the local folks and everything like that, and then you left. And so here's all these people that you had these intimate, intense relationships with for 4 or 5 days, building for this event. For many of them, they would tell you, that's the event of my lifetime. I can't believe the honor of being able to be. These are people like policeman who stood on guard duty, or somebody who worked as a receptionist in your office or something like that, or president of a university, and here you've had that intense relationship, and then you sort of say, I got to leave, and of course they'll say, oh, won't you come over to dinner? We'd love to have you do this or that. So, and then you eventually get to catch back up with those that you had particularly good memories about, or you'd be back in town and you give them a call and do that. But it was hard at first to understand the idea of why you moved on. And as I said, it was really, the moment was not really about you when this was over. The moment was about that wonderful feeling that they all had of going through and experiencing a presidential visit and being a part of making that trip successful.
Do you join the campaign full time in '72?
I did, yeah. I went to work for what was then called CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President, and we worked out of the White House because we were White House advance folks, but we were on their payroll and worked for them. And so
you weren't in 1701?
No, it was not in 1701. It was mostly on the road most of the time. But yeah, during that period of time, as a matter of fact, I don't even know if I may have gone in the front door of the elect. There were several of us like that who signed up, and I did mine very early in '72. I think it was January.
So even before John
for all
Mitchell.
intents and purposes, I went through that year's campaign, and had been involved with it before as a volunteer. So I took a leave of absence from the bank that I worked at, not knowing what was going to happen, and there was no promises of anything. So you just figured, to me, how's this ever going to happen again to me? I'm going to take advantage of this, something I would tell my grandchildren and things of that nature. And it was probably one of the best things I did in my life, because again, at the time it was exciting, but looking back on it again, just an incredible growing experience of helping you understand a lot of the rules of leadership and management and how to operate under pressure and things of that nature.
The president didn't travel as much as '72 as he had, obviously, in '68.
No, he didn't.
So who were you advancing for most of the time? The surrogates program or the family?
Not very often. We had people who, in the office, had First Family, First Lady, or one of the girls that they would go out and advance for. And I think I did the Chinese ping pong team in LA. That was one of my stops at that time. Brought them all in. So there were a few things of that nature, but there was enough things to keep you involved. What happens is, particularly in '72. If you were still a volunteer, non-paid volunteer, you didn't get called on as often, because those of us that were there obviously, could do more. So for us, it was reasonably busy, more so than the amount of travel would seem to lead you to believe. But
did you help plan the convention?
Yeah, we had Bill Timmons was the master at running conventions, and that's a title he, I think, still holds. And he was down there and worked with Ron and with Dwight and all, putting the planning in place. And then those of us, they slot us in blocks, so to speak. Advance men would come down and we get our assignment, in there. So there was a big assignment, which is what you were supposed to do to be your marquee event, if you will, and then you pitched in and helped out all the other times that you were there, whether it was painting signs or whether it was blowing up balloons or whatever. And it was in Florida in '72, and so I got the assignment to create what was called Nixon's Navy. And so it was my job, having been in the Navy and known a little bit something about boats all my life, was to go around wherever I could and see if I could sign up all these people who would come down the causeway in their boats with big signs with Nixon and all that in front of the convention hotel and capture the media, and then we'd have some campaign spokespeople that would come out and everything like this. And so that was my marquee event, if you will. And it turned out really, really great. It was really a lot of fun. A lot of people worked on it, decorated the boats, and again, people got in the spirit of it. They'd come, we'd say, okay, let's go over here, and some of them would come from 20 miles away, come down the intercoastal waterway. Then they'd have their signs, and people would wave at them, come over here, and they would say, I want to be a part of this, and they would jump on the boats and all. So it was one of those sort of spontaneous things that actually ended up being better than you thought it was going to be, because it sort of captured the essence of what they were trying to do.
And this was done, again, under a creep. So I guess, who are you working for in
I'm
creep?
not sure who, if I'm not in finance, so I didn't know what that was. But when you do things connected to the convention, oftentimes they come out of a convention budget. I've done a lot of conventions since then, but back then I'm not sure how that all did. All I did is I had my assignment, knew what I had to do, and I did it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just asking you, who did you work for in creep? Who was your boss there?
I didn't work for anybody in creep.
Really?
No, I worked for Ron Walker.
So straight to Ron, and then
Yeah,
okay.
I would happen to be on the payroll for Creep.
Oh, so you were basically paid by
I
Creep.
worked in the White House advance office.
Okay.
Yeah, as I said, I think only once did I even go in the front door.
So you didn't
Creep.
even. So nothing with Jeb, nothing with Fred Malik, nothing like that.
No,
okay.
I wasn't involved. There were a couple of us, John Gartland and myself, and I think one or two others we had been doing this long enough that they just put us right in. Now there were a number of other advanced people who were actually run out of Creep
Right.
and had a place over there, but yeah,
And had to
for
study
whatever reason got to stay in the
Yeah.
White House. Yeah.
because they would have to study the manual from scratch.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. The famous manual.
The
yeah.
famous manual, and there's actually several versions of that. I don't remember if it starts in 60 or 62, but every year it would get a little bit bigger
Yep,
and a little
yep.
bit bigger. And
Yeah, but the one thing you always remember that when you open that up, the first thing it said, "Hats will kill you," and that was because they were convinced there was never a good picture of Richard Nixon with a hat on. And if you ever let anybody lay a hat on top of his head, that'd probably be your last advance. So.
well, there's this famous picture, I think, is of Calvin Coolidge wearing an Indian headdress,
Yes.
which I think is something they wanted to avoid at
Yeah,
all costs.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. I've seen several like that.
I think I've seen one picture of President Nixon in a hat, but it was Congressman Nixon. I think he was a much younger man.
Yeah.
What's your view of the campaign like? Are you confident that you join up, early on when it's not a sure proposition, I guess? But are you confident?
I was reasonably confident that in a campaign you're never assured because world events can change, things can happen that prove to be a policy embarrassment or a personal. You just don't know. So, but my experience with how well run the Nixon operation gave me a good deal of confidence that there wasn't going to be a failure in that part. It would have to take something that was outside that universe, and in fact, they did have some really classic events that basically all went well. So there wasn't any campaign embarrassment, if you will, from the standpoint of what we had responsibility for. And at that time, to be honest with you, I paid attention to the news more than the average person, but I wasn't deep into policy. I didn't sign up to have this policy or that try and be done. What I was interested, I believed in what the president was trying to do, so I was aligned in that way, and so it was very easy then to go and join and be a part of it. So I was more concerned about, can we keep executing, with a sharpness so that at least if the election is successful, we can be a part of that success, and that if it isn't successful, we won't have been one of the entities that said, well, gee, if they'd only done better here, you might have been president today. So
Which,
that's
of
sort of how I
course,
approached it.
Well, given the 60 campaign, I'm sure that was, a
Yes.
feeling.
Yeah, yeah. You never know. There was a classic case where you get that little turning moment. It flips. Reagan had one with, during his election when he was going through one of the debates, and you just never know what it's going to do. And I think Jimmy Carter was when the hostages were released, and that just flipped so many things at that point. So, but as I say, a great deal of confidence. They ran a very, very well-oiled professional organization and operation in terms of executing, if you will, as planned.
What happens? Well, first, did you advance any presidential trips in September, October during the handful of trips that he made that year?
Mm-hmm.
Which ones did you do?
Oh, I can't remember exactly the ones. I remember one we did. I did the New Orleans. He went down to New Orleans VFW convention, I believe it was. Yeah. That was.
This is the one with Ron Ziegler.
I was just going to say the famous one when they had the Ron Ziegler incident that they were concerned about and everything. And there was a classic case where I hadn't seen it at that level before, but the the concern and the flexibility all of a sudden, how a threat or a concern develops and how it changes the schedule, and you move and you got to make a lot of last minute adjustments. And that's where, again, the professionalism comes. I mean, you got all this stuff in your head, and they can ask you a question, well, could we go over here, can we cut this, can we do this? And you could say yes, yes, no, yes. Well, if we did this, we do it. And you could very quickly help, in this instance, the Secret Service, who was concerned of what kind of options they had and what could they do to do what they had to do without compromising what you were trying to get done with the VFW in that huge hall down there that they had. So,
what was it like to advance in New Orleans?
Distracting. I mean, New Orleanians are wonderful people, wonderful food, great ambiance, and everything like that. There was this incredible military plus precision that we as advanced men and women were taught to do. And then there's this sort of the New Orleans style of how things get done. And so learning how to adjust that and trying to be polite and keep people's confidence when you say, well, no, I'd love to go to lunch with you, but you knew what that meant. You'd be gone for 3 hours in the middle of the day, and they'd probably had a beer or two with some great food. One of those little lessons. I learned so much from different behaviors and different cultures and how people approach various things. And but again, I think the more you're with a group of people from the local community and they see the thing building and they see it's going to come together, I think they change more, particularly on event day, to become like you, than you change to be like them. They see it, they understand, and essentially what they had their little model of this is how we live our life every day down here, and they behave that way. And we come in and we say, well, if you're going to do this, there is a model to how this works too, and we have to find a coming together where you get to do the things and people see the things that are wonderfully yours, and there's no do-overs in our business. You get one shot and you go, and so that was part of the, how do you call it, persuasion skills that you try and learn to help people understand that everybody's got a stake in the success and we're all different, but let's figure how do we put all that together. And so New Orleans was probably one of the greater challenges in that regard.
Well, it's got to be an interesting mix of skills because you have to think a little bit like a theater director. Mm-hmm. You have to think a little bit like a producer. You have to think a little bit like a salesman.
You're absolutely right.
And then you also have to think, you have to be able to say, well, this is going to be the shot, this is where the camera should be, this is where, and the cameras have to pick up his left side,
Yep.
all these details.
Yeah. I mean, it really teaches you more than anything else that details matter. A lot of times, I get all the details. I'm a big picture person. I don't need to worry about the details and all that. But with that touch, you had to be both a big picture person and to really make sure that big picture stayed intact, despite all the competing reasons why it wouldn't. You had to really get down to the details, and that was a lesson that I learned in spades in that job, and it served me exceptionally well in my professional career once I, left the White House environment.
Did you ever look at the McGovern campaign post Eagleton, McGovern Shriver? Did you ever look at their operations or their events and say, well, I could teach them a few things?
Yeah, I would say each advance operation and of course the related scheduling aspect of it, which is the setup for the advance, is an extension, I think maybe even somewhat subconsciously, of the principle that you're trying to elevate, if you will. And Nixon was a man who liked everything, clean, well-turned, and precise, and knew exactly what the next thing was. Other people are less that way, and you could, having done a lot more advanced work beyond my first exposure with Nixon, I've learned to be able to pick that out, and you can pretty well tell the persona of the individual and the likely reason why their advance operation behaves like it does, because it really is an extension of the individual and what that individual perceives they want to achieve out of the appearance.
Well, how much time had you spent with Richard Nixon by '72, by Election Day '72?
Not too much personally. He kept much to himself, and I think when you're on the road, particularly when you're out at Western White House, you got an opportunity to be a little closer than maybe the normal person does. But I didn't get, a whole lot except when we're in an event context, and Steve Bull would be there, and he'd want to know what's next, and we'd be standing there, and he would say, "Well, Red, show him the picture about what we're going to do or what we're going to do." So you had those kind of things of a business nature, and then it exchanged a few pleasantries. But I can honestly say I never had a chance to sit down and have some long cerebral conversation with Richard Nixon. But I'd never expected to, and that wasn't what I was offering to the team, and I didn't really have anything that I could tell him I think would have improved his lot in life, shall we say.
What happens after the campaign is over, after President Nixon has won re-election?
That was kind of interesting. I got asked by Ron, turned over the mantle. He was headed off to the National Park Service as director, and he turned over the mantle to Bill Hinkle, who was one of his full-time folks, who was then going to head up the office. And Bill asked me if I would come and join and be his number two guy. And I said, "Wow, that would be fantastic, but I've got a couple things I got to ask my wife, and I've got to go talk to my employer and find out what." So I went home and talked to my wife about this, and she of course says, "Well, when and how much are they going to pay you, and how do we do all this?" And I had a whole bunch of questions. Well, I was at that point young and euphoric about the opportunity, and I said, "Well, these are people that I've known now for years and all, and they couldn't be that precise or chose not to, but trust me, it'll all work out." So we sold our house, packed our kids up, and travel at your own expense, and also put all our stuff in there, and headed back to Washington D.C. from Southern California. And so she trusted me a long way, because we never did know until we actually got there, and it all worked out just fine. So that was a period of time where you're euphoric and you're excited, but then you're worrying about, I hope all this stuff really does come together like it's planned. And when it finally did, it was just a great sense of, wow, this is real. I'm on the White House staff. I actually have an office in the EOB, and I'm going to be a part of, what at that time we thought was going to be, really a very successful culmination of a career of building to achieve great things.
Did you come on as a staff assistant?
Staff assistant, right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you come on, I'm guessing January, February 73. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. You're now playing in an entirely different ball game, and we're going to talk a little bit about one of the trips you advanced in 74 a little bit later, but now you have to start worrying about international trips as well.
Yes, yeah.
What are the complications about moving from domestic advance to international advance?
I think, for me, not that much different. I mean, I had done a lot of them by the time, I was there full time. I wasn't really a rookie, and I had seen enough, had done enough that I felt reasonably confident. And for an international trip, you get pre-briefed by all the people there before you go over for a pre-advance, which is to go over and see what's there and then come back. And of course, you have State Department, and you've got all their experts, and you've got the CIA folks and their. You're just so you felt. I felt, at least I can speak for myself, I felt pretty good about the fact that this is another great challenge. Obviously, then you're going to get into the politics of the country you're visiting, and you're going to get into the tough negotiating sessions and language barriers and a lot of other things that we all know, but not that much different. Not that much different.
What else are you working on in 73? What are some of the trips that you advanced then? Because the president, especially after March, April, is in a different situation than when he was a year earlier.
Yeah, I think I spent a fair amount of time working with Dave Parker at the time, and he turned over Terry O'Donnell was one of his assistants and all, and we spent time looking for venues. By then, the atmosphere from the war, from the politics and everything like that was pretty hostile in some areas. So you couldn't just go someplace and expect to have a positive event. The event would be the disturbance or whatever the people who created the disturbance wanted to convey. So we spent time looking for and trying to find, events that would fit the kind of messages the president was trying to convey, would give him a chance to interact. And one thing Nixon really did is he thrived, I guess, like a lot of politicians do, from the personal touch of people when you're out on the campaign stump or out doing public events, the connection with real folks, which as president you don't get too much of an opportunity to see because you become fairly isolated. So that's what we did, was go out, find venues, come back, talk about how they could be put together as a proposal and what you do, and then they would go forward to be looked at, and then we'd execute them from there. And then later on, what ended up is with the Spiro Agnew circumstance, we had to then take over with Jerry Ford, who was brought in, and so I'll probably say this in a shorthand way, but we were sort of called in, and one of the things that we were told is that you're going to be a big part of Jerry Ford. He's a consummate politician, well liked by everybody, knows every bit about the government in ways that other people don't. But he's been a congressman all this period of time, and he doesn't really have any appreciation for what goes on here. He's never had anybody doing a dance for him or any of these kind of things. So he said, what we want to do is have you all sort of take the primary ownership of him. And Dewey Clower was sort of given the assignment of sort of being the point person and working with then Vice President Ford's staff, and we provided the manpower and the staff support to him to allow him to do that. And his principal role was to go out and be on the front lines of helping people be confident that the government's still working. This change in vice president wasn't going to make a difference in who he was, and particularly talking to a lot of the party faithful who didn't know what was going on and that. So that was a period of time where he began to tread into territory that I think the history books may probe it much deeper, but it was kind of a change and a kind of an experience that was really hard to know what the end game was going to be. Obviously, you knew what you'd like was to have that transition that Vice President Ford went through to be somewhat seamless, not detract away from the bigger messages and the things the president was trying to do, and help people who were supporters feel comfortable and confident that people still knew what was going on and there was still the kind of leadership that they had voted for and wanted to be. So that was that period. It was kind of a little bit of a blur, frankly. We were very busy because of the added effort that we did with Ford. And I think Dewey did a great job, along with some other folks, of accommodating, again, as I mentioned to you, the style of how you advance somebody is as much a function of that person and their demeanor as it is about the nuts and bolts. So you have to marry the two together. And I think that they got fairly comfortable. The president did, and one of the nice things I think was tribute to that work that group did is when Jerry Ford took over, he asked me to be the head of his advance office. So I got that chance and the familiarity and having known him. But so that was probably that period of time from January of '73 until that August 9th day. Yeah. A period of time when we saw a lot of things that people didn't really expect to see at the White House, and how you fit in on them, and where we were in that role was different by different things, because a lot of the things were, with the White House counsel's office, and a lot of things were in the policy area, and less of an emphasis on the kind of campaign mode we'd been in for so many years before that.
Well, I want to ask a little bit more about the Ford work and during the Nixon administration. But did anybody advance Spiro Agnew?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Who was working on that shop?
John Damgard, who, as a matter of fact, by pure coincidence, about an hour ago, he and I were in a series of meetings, and I gave him a ride back down here, and his office is about 2 blocks away from here. He's still, he's in an association business. He's been there for now over 20 years. But yeah.
A lot of the advanced guys and the scheduling guys have ended up in the association business.
They sure did, yeah. Yeah. Sort of like the breeding ground for some reason. It gave you that set of skills or that aptitude at least to be able to work in a consensus environment. And a lot of that is about what associations are supposed to be doing.
Well, it's just because Vice President Agnew in particular, more of this in the first term, because the second term was even shorter for him, obviously, had a lot of high-profile events. The nattering nabobs of negativism, the 70 campaign, this sort of a thing. And so it was just, if the advanced team is melded to suit the personality, I was going to say if there's anything that we could, deduce from the way the advanced operation worked there about how
we obviously they had their own operation and it was independent from ours. We knew the players in there and the ones that were involved, but there wasn't much overlap in terms of, some people would do an event as a volunteer in there, but on the full-time staff it was a rare opportunity because we were pretty short-handed by much of that time, either in the campaign mode where you were doing a lot more so you ate up people, or even in 73 and 74 when there wasn't so much going on, you didn't have very much people to use. So we knew them, we knew how they ran their operations, and obviously we traded, how to do things easier, and technology helped in some of those cases. But they were, as I say, sort of separate, but very much Spiro Agnew had a different approach in terms of what he considered to be a schedule, and when he went someplace, what kind of activities and events he wanted to do, how much personal time he wanted, and various things like that. So again, it's the style, and that's. I was fortunate to serve in the White House with three U.S. presidents, and to me, the one big takeaway was the White House is an institution. It is our government. We elect somebody to go and people it for a period of time, and they do their thing. But while it stays the White House, it is a very different operation. And it's based in part, again, like the same story I told about the advanced person. It reflects the persona and of the person that's in there, and it adjusts and figures out how to operate as efficiently as it can, or in some cases, not so efficiently, because that's sort of the way the principle is. And so getting a chance to see that and watching I got to see the Vice President Ford thing from the very beginning because that happened. I didn't get to see Agnew do that, but then we later got to see Nelson Rockefeller come in that role during the Ford years when he had to find a vice president and all. So it's been it's very interesting. I try and be a little bit of a student of human behavior and what goes on, and watching how people form and how they telescope what their likes and preferences are and then of course you have a group of people who are in the business of making sure those get taken care of. So they happen fairly quick, and the adjustments come fairly quick as well.
Well, let's talk about Ford a little bit more, because in a way the Nixon 68 campaign, the Nixon advance operation, had almost redefined what it meant to be involved in presidential politics, in real national politics. And Congressman Ford, and now Vice President Ford, had been involved in national level politics, but being a creature of the Hill is a very different thing. And campaigning in Grand Rapids is not like campaigning in...
Yeah. But the other thing, he and Richard Nixon, while they were close political allies and had a great respect for one another, they were two very different people. Richard Nixon had an intellect that, I say this not in an unkind way, it's very bookish. He liked to have briefing books with all the information and all the contingency plans and things, and he liked to be able to absorb it all there, and then he would, after he'd been through all that, then he'd talk to his key expert or two and do this. Jerry Ford, because of his Hill background, where you don't have time to read very much stuff, he was most comfortable when he'd get 5 or 6 respected people in the Oval Office or when we're on the road, gather around a sofa or something like that, and he'd say, okay, well, we're going to be looking at this issue, and he'd have some brief, cogent papers he would have read a little bit about, but he was, and you could just watch his mastery of how to interact with people and how to draw out, you know, sincere recommendations and things that were helpful to the project was very good. So here were these two people occupied the same office during the same 4 years, you know, one on the front end, one on the back end, and yet their behaviors were very, very different. I think what helped President Ford was by my being asked to go and serve as the one that headed up his office. I took all the learnings and the precision and the care that we were able to execute at a level that he'd not seen, and I think helped give him a sense of comfort that he could travel at a high pace. And one of the things he had to do, of course, when he took over, we were talking about 1974, middle of August, we're going to have congressional elections. We're going to be coming up in a fairly short period of time. And so working with Dean Birch and the folks at the RNC, I mean, we essentially traveled at a pace that I'm not sure too many people have matched. And it was the idea for President Ford to go out there and give confidence to the faithful, try and excite the people that the Republican brand was still the right way to go, and, you know, voting to continue the policies of the president was the right thing to do. And so there was it was a very intense period of time, and we survived it. You know, going through it. And my hat's off to Dean Birch and some of the older people, in the sense of they had seen this many times over in different variations and were able to help those of us who were still learning the ropes on how to do this, particularly the political part.
Just want to ask, are we?
Time to change
Yeah,
sheets.
I thought so.
Okay.
Nice time.